The room vibrated with impatience, the kind of fever that rises when a company is weeks from a board review. Laptops were half closed, ready to spring. Graphs pulsed across 4 wall-mounted displays. A sleek, blinking speakerphone watched like an unblinking eye. People spoke over one another, a tangle of ideas and ego that to most ears would have formed an ocean of noise. To John, it was all light. He sat at the far end of the long walnut table, hands folded, back straight. The chair boasted ergonomic this and that's no one ever adjusted. The table's reflection was so clean it made faces into ghosts. John's eyes traveled the glossy plane, mouths flicking open and shut, syllables breaking like tiny waves against teeth, while the rest of his body went still. He could feel the air conditioner's hum in the legs of the table. He could feel, more than hear, the late summer thunder that the building trapped and translated into a constant, throbbing presence. He watched their lips. On the wall, a line chart dipped and rose. On the line chart, Project Alpha, core to the company's next fiscal year. Behind the chart, a mirror-paneled skyline, San Jose's edges glinting. Between chart and skyline, the reflection of Michael Hart, head of operations, sun-browned, blazerless, smiling the kind of smile that says, "Trust me, because I do not flinch." Michael's mouth shaped 3 words to a cluster of 2 men and 1 woman leaning toward him at the near corner of the table. Round-trip the funds. Not allowed. Never allowed in a room like this. But John caught the words in the slick choreography of lips and tongue, the jaw's precise economy, the cut of teeth on an F. He blinked, focused. The woman, dark hair pulled tight, a thin gold chain disappearing at the notch of her collarbone, whispered back. John tracked her mouth the way a hawk tracks a mouse under grass. Vendor Shell. Shearwater. LLC. John swallowed. He had learned long ago how to read in light what others said in sound. He did it without thinking now. But sometimes the meaning arrived with a force that made his body react, as if sound had suddenly broken into his world through a different door. He pulled his eyes to the wall charts to steady himself. Even from here, he could see the smaller font labels. Alpha, DevOps, Alpha, third-party contracts, Alpha, cloud credits, and a slow parade of numbers that, hours earlier, he had reconciled against a compliance sheet with the unhurried diligence of a man no one would ever call brilliant. Diligent, indispensable in a way that should not need to be said, and yet never was. Michael looked down the table. "We need alignment." His lips formed in broad, easy strokes. "Board in 3 weeks. No more surprises." John tracked the rest without effort. QA's lead arguing about test coverage. A product manager's blizzard of buzzwords. The finance liaison, a boyish man named Darren Lee, promising that the variance on vendor contracts would normalize in Q4. John saw Darren's mouth form normalized twice, too slickly, too quickly. He filed it away. The head of data science, a woman with a precise dancer's posture, Priya Rao, didn't speak at all during the posturing. She simply watched, and when she did glance at Michael, it was with the detached curiosity of an academic who knew she was in an ecology study disguised as a meeting. John had never been sure where to place her in the company's theater. He'd seen her nod to him in the hallway once, a brief acknowledgement that didn't feel like pity. That alone made him notice her more. At the far wall, the glass door whispered open and shut as 2 latecomers slid in. John tracked mouths, but also hands. The nervous rub of a thumb against a phone case, the ritualistic tap-tap of a pen. He took in everything. For him, meaning was not an arrow fired from a mouth into an ear. Meaning was net and lattice, 1,000 threads he learned to gather as a child when words were gestures in air and tremors underfoot. Hide the float, Darren's mouth shaped, leaning toward Michael when the heads at the table dipped to read their screens. Bill Alpha for Beta's burn. Alpha for Beta. John held his breath. The kind of misallocation that starts small, softened by jargon, float, burn, and then becomes a habit the way people adopt bad posture. He tracked the trio. Michael's lips, they won't see it. Priya's eyes flicked once, sharp as a blade. Her mouth didn't move. The woman with the gold chain added, "After board sign-off, we redirect to Shearwater." Her lips shaped Shearwater the way a violinist shapes a note you can feel in your ribs. John had not seen that name in any vendor list. He would have noticed. He notices that kind of thing like a locksmith notices when a key has been cut a degree too shallow. A slide changed. The room's posture followed. Michael stood. He talked about trust. John read it 3 times in 3 sentences, and velocity, and ambition, and prudent risk. The words marched on. People nodded. There was even laughter, captured in shoulders and quivering chests, because in this room laughter loved to land like a feather. No one looked at the man at the end of the table who was reading all of it like an indictment. When the meeting broke, chairs scraped the floor. Vibrating cup lids made their small thunder. People gathered their devices, their power cords, their pride. Michael clapped a hand against Darren's shoulder and mouth, almost imperceptibly. "We're fine." He had not looked back at John. None of them did. That was their mistake. John stayed seated. He watched his reflection sit with him in the table for a long breath. He felt for the old coil of nerves he kept well hidden, the one tied to years of being told that his version of reality needed a witness who could hear. He stared after the closing door. The room exhaled the last scent of espresso. The stillness opened like a lake. He took out his notebook. Not the company notebook with its embossed logo, but the one he bought at a Chinatown stationery store where the proprietor's hands spoke to him with the easy clarity of someone who had learned to communicate with motion long before she learned to sell pens. The notebook was green, soft to the touch, good paper that didn't bleed. He wrote, "Round trip the funds. Shearwater, LLC. Use alpha to cover beta burn. Hide the float. After board sign off, redirect." He paused. Wrote the names, Michael Hart, Darren Lee, unknown woman, gold chain. He added physical details. He drew arrows. His handwriting was exacting. There was no flourish. He had trained it that way, to be a mirror of the way he moved through the world, quiet, accurate, capable of standing on its own. Then he opened his laptop. John's desktop was the opposite of most desktops in tech. No screensaver collage. No sticky notes with inspirational lies. A single folder named Compass, a private joke he allowed himself, because in a company whose slogans borrowed the language of voyages, he was the one person who truly navigated by a different star. Inside Compass, subfolders by project, by fiscal quarter, by vendor. Inside those, tables he had made, so often he could build them in his sleep, cost center by cost center, cross-checked against access logs, cross-checked again against approvals. People thought compliance was about rules. John knew it was about narrative. Dollars do not vanish. They walk. They always leave footprints. You just need to learn where to look. He checked Alpha's vendor list. His eyes ran down the names, filtering for the shape of letters as quickly as other people filter for brand. No Shearwater. He ran a query across contracts signed in the past 6 months. Nothing. He opened the procurement system's search box and typed Shearwater. The cursor blinked back, empty. Then he widened the net, searched for contracts created, and then canceled within 72 hours. A cluster appeared, canceled invoices from a firm in Nevada called Shorewing Analytics. He felt the jolt in his chest again. Shorewing. He mouthed it soundlessly, tested it against the earlier shape, Shearwater, a shell that changed its feathers. He clicked in his Shorewing's filings. A foreign agent, a registered officer name that read like a shrug. An address shared by 36 LLCs that had never shipped anything heavier than a story. But the canceled invoices, 6 of them, were for cloud consulting, $147,000 each. Identical descriptions. Identical line items. All canceled a day after they were created. He leaned back. In the polished dark of the screen, he could see his face. The lines at the corners of his eyes deeper than he remembered, his hair a shade lighter than it had been last year. He wrinkled his nose, smelled pine, the cleaning crew's favorite. The office had emptied to a gentle ghosting. He stood, stretched the ache out of his shoulder, old habit from carrying a backpack the size of a small country in college, and walked to the window. Down below, Market Street made a wet ribbon out of headlights. A bus hissed and glided. 2 food trucks faced off under an umbrella of fluorescent. John pressed his palm to the glass and felt the city's pulse in the vibration. Somewhere in him, the boy who had pressed his ear to the hardwood floor to feel his father's steps felt it, too. Okay, he signed to himself, finger-spelling the word with the unconscious grace of someone who had been fluent in silence all his life. He turned back. He built a report. He did what he always did when he told a story. He made it impossible to ignore by making it impossible to misunderstand. He screenshotted the canceled invoices, annotated them with dates and unique identifiers, mapped them against internal emails authorizing last-minute changes to budget allocations, emails he had access to because no one ever thought to remove compliance from the CC when they were forging consensus. He assembled a timeline. He quoted policy. He cross-referenced vendor vetting requirements to show where the process had been bypassed, emergency procurement exception, invoked 3 times in a quarter where there had been no emergency. He inserted a short note about round-tripping, not as accusation, but as definition, each sentence a rung on a ladder someone could climb even if they didn't want to. When he was done, the document was 20 pages long. He called it Preliminary Findings Re. Project Alpha Variances and External Vendor Irregularities. He considered that title. He considered changing irregularities to anomalies. He kept irregularities. The truth disliked euphemism. He saved. He printed a copy for himself and slipped it into a file folder as green as the notebook. He stared at the printer as it worked, unable to hear its chatter, watching each page birth the next like a magician's silk. At 8:20, he closed his laptop, slid the green folder into his backpack, and left the room that had held the day's most important secret like a mouth holds breath. The hallway lights dimmed into evening mode. The building's elevators, glass-backed and oddly theatrical, rode him down in a whoosh he could only feel in his knees. In the lobby, Lena, the receptionist with a sunflower tattoo, raised a hand. She had learned the sign for good night after he'd smiled at her first week and finger-spelled his name to avoid the awkward half-yell most people attempted. She signed good night now with a little flourish that made it look like confetti. He smiled back, made the motion in reply, and stepped out into a warm breeze that smelled faintly of jasmine from a landscaping hedge that had somehow survived a drought. John walked 3 blocks to the light rail. Every city he had lived in taught him a new sound to watch. This one taught him to watch headlights and mouth shapes in driver's side windows. He rode standing, braced by a pole whose nicks and scratches told a different set of stories. His stop was near the building where he rented a small apartment that caught morning light and overlooked a courtyard in which a single cypress tree had grown in spite of everything. At home, John lined his shoes next to one another. He put his backpack on the counter. He made tea, not because he especially liked tea, but because it gave his hand something to do that did not involve typing. He sat on his small balcony and let traffic's distant vibration press against him the way ocean surf pressed against children on the shore. He set the green folder on the table. He traced its edge with a finger. He knew what came next. He would take the report to compliance. He would give it to Linda Park, the director, a woman whose forehead wore the shallow valley of years spent trying to convince adults to act like adults. He admired Linda. She did not pretend to be what she was not. In meetings, she wore a small silver pin and said sentences with verbs that did not apologize for themselves. He also knew what came after next. Disbelief, doubt, perhaps anger. He set his tea down. The cup trembled in the heat, or perhaps it was his hand. He remembered the first time a teacher had told him he must have misheard. He had been 8. He had not misheard. He had watched the boy at the front say jerk under his breath. He had told the teacher exactly what the boy's mouth had said. The teacher had smiled a kind, terrible smile and told him it was hard for him to interpret things sometimes and perhaps he should focus on his art project. He had decided that day to become the best interpreter of movement he could be, to take in the world the way a diver takes in water, completely without needing it to change. He closed his eyes and saw Michael's mouth say round trip. He saw Darren's mouth say float. He saw the woman's mouth say shearwater. He felt again the room's complacent gravity. He opened his eyes and turned to the page where his report ended. There, he typed a final paragraph in crisp, cool font. Recommendation: Immediate freeze on Project Alpha vendor disbursements pending review. Initiate forensic accounting of canceled invoices. See Appendix B. Interview Michael Hart and Darren Lee regarding procurement exceptions and Project Beta cost center reallocation. Confirm beneficial ownership of Shorewing Analytics / Shearwater LLC with Secretary of State filings. Notify Audit Committee Chair confidentially. In the morning, he would act. He slept poorly, if it could be called sleep. His dreams were always dim and tactile, cohering from touches and flashes in his stories that unspooled without dialogue. Tonight, he dreamed of a ledger that turned into a river and of small paper boats that did not sink because their numbers made them buoyant. He woke before the vibration alarm he placed beneath his pillow. He lay there and watched the square of morning light on the wall move like a mouth forming an O. He dressed in a pale blue shirt and a gray jacket he rarely wore. It carried the faint smell of the dry cleaner, a chemical mint that reminded him of routines other people considered mundane and he considered choreography. He made himself a sandwich, wrapped it, placed it in his bag with a report, and wrote a quick note on the margin of his grocery list. Ask me a copy of procurement flowchart. Mia. He smiled despite everything. Mia worked in UX research, but had a hobbyist obsession with systems. Where he built maps of numbers, she built maps of people. She was one of the few who had learned to sign. Not fluently, not with the round, fast music of native hands, but with a care that honored Speed's less glamorous sibling, precision. They had fallen into a friendship that felt like an old sweater. Unremarkable to anyone who didn't wear it, exactly right to the one who did. Mia would not be in early. She was not a morning person. John scribbled lunch next to her name on his mental calendar. The office at 8:30 was a cathedral to productivity. Light poured across glass partitions like a benediction. Digital signage in the lobby announced a minor acquisition with bold verbs. John rode the elevator with a man who had once called him the subtitles guy in a tone that suggested affection while serving condescension. He nodded anyway. You could not unteach the world overnight. On the compliance floor, the carpet changed texture. The usual startup concrete gave way to thick, serious gray that took each footstep hostage. Linda's office door was open. She stood by the window, mug in hand, watching the tiny choreography of people crossing the courtyard below. She turned when she sensed movement. Her mouth shaped a greeting with the unself-conscious clarity of someone who had spent a year training herself to speak to John in a way he could read with ease. Good morning, John. He smiled, lifted a hand. Good morning. He sat, placed the green folder on her desk, slid it toward her with a neatness that seemed to please her. He watched her eyes take in the folder the way a surgeon takes inventory, not impatient, but not indulging any extra seconds either. What's this? Her mouth asked, her eyebrows rising a degree. He gestured. Preliminary findings. Project Alpha. Vendor irregularities. Possible misallocation and shell routing. He spoke as he sometimes did, a word here and there, enunciated carefully, the voice that remained as despite its infrequent use, quiet but steady. I think there is theft. The word hung fat and heavy between them. He didn't like it, but words were sometimes necessary the way a flare is necessary on a dark sea. Linda sat. She opened the folder. She read faster than most. John watched her mouth press flat. Release, press again. He watched her eyes triangulate. Document, screen, internal knowledge. She asked 2 questions with her mouth that he answered with a nod and a finger spelling a date. Then she looked back up. This is serious, she said. She leaned back, the chair's leather whispering against the fabric of her blazer. You're alleging misconduct by Michael Hart? He swallowed. Alleging irregularities consistent with misconduct. He had learned to be precise. He had learned to build bridges sturdy enough that people afraid of crossing would still cross, because the alternative was a flood. Okay, Linda said. We'll do this by the book. I'm going to log this as a confidential report to the audit committee. We'll preserve the doc, get legal, inform HR, scope limited, freeze alpha disbursements by end of day if we can do it without alerting anyone. John, she paused. The use of his name, without a smile, was a good sign. How did you catch this? He met her eyes. He signed. The meeting yesterday. I read their mouths. He added, because he knew he had to, because the myth demanded an offering. Round trip. Shearwater. Float. Afterboard. Linda did not smile. She did not wince. You've always had good eyes, she said, which was as close as any manager had ever come to saying, I trust your way of seeing. She tapped a pen. 2 light taps that John felt in the desk more than heard. We'll need corroboration, you know. Paper. Logs. He slid a printout across. Appendix B, he said, the words careful, exact. Cancellations. Shore wing analytics. Nevada. Linda's eyebrows rose a millimeter. Of course it's Nevada, she mouthed, a private joke she didn't intend to share. This is good work. She looked at him. You understand this will get difficult. He nodded. He had lived in difficult for so long that when things were easy, he felt a little unmoored. He signed, I understand. He added, after a beat, please keep my name out as long as possible. Absolutely, she said, and he believed her. I'll route this to legal and the committee. I'll ask you to sit on anything that looks like a trigger. No emails to anyone you think is involved. We'll do the forensics quietly. He nodded again. He stood. Linda stood with him. She reached across the desk. He shook her hand, surprised at the warmth of the gesture, aware of how much he missed touch in the middle of days spent reading faces. Back in the hallway, he exhaled a breath he did not know he had been keeping. He felt the building's deep motor hum through the soles of his shoes. He walked toward the elevator and stopped. Down the corridor, a glass-walled conference room held a small meeting. Darren, the finance liaison, the woman with the gold chain, now wearing a pale scarf, and Michael, whose body language was a lesson in sprezzatura. They were laughing. He could see it in their chests and cheekbones. Darren glanced up and saw John. For a fraction of a second, his smile twitched. It wasn't fear. It was calculation. John lifted his chin in a greeting so small it did not have to be returned. He turned toward the elevators. His phone buzzed in his pocket, not with sound, but with the hard, polite knock of a vibration. A message from Mia. Coffee later? Need to pick your brain on consent flows. He thumbed back. Lunch? He added a small emoji he rarely used because it felt juvenile, then kept it because Mia collected emojis the way other people collected stamps. At his desk, John opened his email to find a calendar invite. Audit review. Confidential. 10 a.m. Linda. Legal. One name he didn't recognize. He accepted. He took a breath. He looked at the open office, all glass and better-intentioned transparency, and thought about the ways people could be invisible even here. He thought of the child he had been in a classroom where sound ricocheted and adults mistook silence for absence. He thought of the young man in college who had built and rebuilt a world out of captioning and open-source tools and the stubborn belief that he could be what he needed. He opened Compass. He started assembling a second document, FAQs for non-technical reviewers. It was how he solved panic by making something someone else could use. He defined float. He drew a diagram of round-tripping that would make sense to someone who had never balanced a checkbook. He added a section titled, What Lip Reading Is and Isn't. Under it, he wrote, Lip reading is not magic. It is margin of error married to pattern recognition. In aggregate, with context, it can be highly reliable. It is a tool, not a verdict. He saved and sent it to Linda with a short note. Then he stood and stretched again. Across the aisle, a junior engineer named Vic gave him a thumbs up, the kind of generic thumbs up people give when they want to be friendly in a hallway. John smiled back. It was enough. At 10, in a smaller room with blinds drawn, Linda walked him through next steps. The legal counsel, Michelle, sharp-eyed, asked him methodical questions. He answered them in the way he had learned to answer such questions, with precisely as much detail as required and nothing ornamental. He watched their mouths, but he also watched their eyes. He watched how often each one looked at the door at the ceiling at him. When he finished, Michelle took a breath that lifted her shoulders a centimeter. We can move on this, she said. We'll need to lock down accesses. Linda nodded. I'll place holds. The third person, a man from internal audit he hadn't met, didn't speak until the end. John, his mouth said without condescension, this is good work. He was not accustomed to hearing that said to him in a room that mattered. He nodded. "Thank you," he said, the words like polished stones laid carefully on the table. After walking back to his desk, he passed the kitchen where a bowl of bruised plums waited with a sign that said "Take me." He took one. He bit into it. The juice ran down his wrist. He licked it with an absent-mindedness that would have embarrassed him if anyone had been watching. He threw the pit away. He sat at his desk and breathed for 3 seconds, a meditation he had started doing in elevators to avoid the spirals that sometimes came when the world demanded he be louder than he wished to be. At 12:28, Mia leaned against his cubicle wall with a paper boat hat folded from a sticky note stuck to her hair like a Johnny crown. He laughed, not with sound but with a mouth that made a smile big enough to be a laugh. She signed hungry? He signed back always and stood. They ate at a food truck that made bowls of rice and pickled vegetables that Mia claimed were like a hug if a hug was umami. She told him a story about a user interview that went sideways when a product manager insisted on explaining the product to the user. He told her, in the shorthand of friends who speak across modalities, that something big was happening at work and he couldn't talk about it yet. She nodded, her face serious for a moment. Then she knocked her knuckles gently against his and said "You've got this" in wobbly ASL that made him want to hug her and also made him want to teach her the smoother version. When he returned, there was an email from Linda. "Freeze placed on alpha disbursements. Please do not discuss with anyone. We'll loop you back when we have preliminary confirmations." His heartbeat made a slow drum in his neck. He closed his eyes. He imagined dollars changing their course like fish when the light shifts. At 3:12, security badges chirped in a pattern that meant nothing to him, but the movement in the hallway did. People began to drift past with that peculiar speed that says we're not hurrying while hurrying. John stood and looked. Down the corridor, Michael walked with HR's director, a woman with an expression like a half-lowered visor. Darren followed 2 steps behind. None of them looked toward John. He returned to his chair. He did not expect the message that arrived at 3:19. It was from an unknown address. Subject line, "Careful." The body contained a single line. "You saw what you think you saw. Don't be a hero." No signature. He read it twice. He checked the headers. Routed through 3 servers, 2 proxies any intern could rent by the hour. He flagged it. He sent it to Linda. He sat back and looked at the small bruise of sky visible between 2 buildings and thought, so be it. He left at 6 because leaving at 6 is how you do not look like a person with a secret. On the way out, he passed Michael at the elevator bank. For the smallest instant, their eyes met. John held the gaze. Michael's mouth made a smile that meant nothing. The elevator arrived. They stepped in with 2 others. John faced forward. He could feel every breath, each shift of weight. He imagined he could hear the cables sing, the way you can imagine the sea inside a shell if you've ever heard it once. At the lobby, Michael stepped out first. He adjusted his cuffs. He looked back with an expression that had charmed investors and interns alike, and said a single word with his mouth that would have been invisible to anyone not looking directly at him. "Careful." It was not a threat. It was a suggestion wearing a threat's cologne. John let the word land. He did not respond. He walked into the evening, the air's warmth a hand on the back of his neck. He turned left instead of right and made a longer loop to the station. He watched the windows. He watched the way streetlight broke over chrome. He watched the city the way he always did, as text. At home, he did not turn on music. He did not own speakers. He put his hands under the faucet and watched water ride his skin. He cooked, ate, cleaned, all of it the way a person says a prayer when he does not believe but wants to. When he sat, finally, the green folder on the table like a small and stubborn meadow, he wrote one more note in his green notebook. "They warned me. So it's working." In the morning, he would wake, read the light on the wall again, and go back. He would watch. He would testify with the only instrument he had ever trusted entirely, his attention. For now, John stared into a silence he did not fear and felt, in that silence, the first tremor of something that might not be victory. He was not naive, but was its ancestor, resolve. The night after delivering the report, John lay awake, staring at the faint glow of streetlight leaking through his blinds. His body wanted rest, but his mind replayed fragments of the day on a relentless loop. Michael's lips forming round trip, Darren's careful hide to float, the cold warning in that anonymous email. Don't be a hero. Each image arrived sharp and merciless. He turned onto his side, pressing a hand against his chest to slow the pounding rhythm, but it was no use. Sleep remained just out of reach. And then the memories began, not of yesterday, but of years before. Because truth never arrives in isolation. It grows in the cracks of the past. He was 8 years old again, back in a classroom that smelled of chalk dust and damp coats. The sentence on the board read, "The cat ran fast." Mrs. Klein crouched slightly as she said, "Read it, John." He tried, shaping the words with effort. The cat ran fast. His voice came out flat, devoid of melody, like each sound was a heavy object dragged across the ground. The room rippled with muffled giggles. Jason Miller, a boy with freckles and a cruel streak, whispered to the girl beside him. John didn't hear the sound, but he saw it clearly, robot cat. The heat rose instantly in John's chest, like fire licking through paper. He raised his hand. "He called me a robot cat." He signed furiously, pointing to Jason. Mrs. Klein's face faltered. She sighed and crouched next to him. "Sometimes, John, it's hard to tell what people are really saying. Maybe you misunderstood. Let's just move on, okay?" Her kindness was worse than Jason's cruelty, because it told John something he would never forget, that his eyes, sharp as they were not considered trustworthy. His perception plus their disbelief equaled nothing. That day, John began to understand invisibility. By high school, he had become meticulous. If someone whispered behind him, he didn't just catch the words, they became etched in him. When a teacher praised another student for a group project John had practically carried, he memorized the precise curl of that teacher's lips and replayed it like a courtroom exhibit. He kept notebooks where he wrote down things no one else noticed. Who borrowed a calculator and didn't return it, who cheated off whose test. He never showed these notes to anyone, but keeping them gave him a sense of control. If he could not speak loudly, he would see completely. At 16, he told his mother he wanted to study computer science. She worried about interviews, about discrimination, about a world that might always underestimate him. But John smiled and wrote in his notebook, "Machines don't care if you hear. Machines only care if you see." College was another battlefield. Lecture halls full of distractions, coughs, laughter, scribbling pens. He had no choice but to watch the professor's lips intently, filtering meaning from shape and rhythm. Sometimes, classmates glanced at him and muttered comments he couldn't help but catch. Does he even get it? He just stares so hard. Yes, he got it. He got it better than most. While others drifted on half attention, John built mental blueprints. He rehearsed every system until it hummed in his head. He graduated in the top tier of his class, not by miracle, but by discipline forged in the fires of underestimation. His first internship was at a startup that called itself a family. Families, he learned, can be the first to forget your name when the fire alarm goes off. In a sprint review, he presented a small but elegant tool that caught mismatched API contracts and flagged them before deployment. The room clapped politely. Later, he watched two engineers at the snack shelf, one with a mouth like a sharpened pencil, say, "Neat toy, not production." A month later, the tool, renamed and polished by someone who knew how to talk in rooms like these, shipped with mild fanfare. John signed the congratulatory card anyway. He had learned that sometimes you let the victory go out wearing someone else's coat because you had more important wars to fight. He met Mia the winter the company moved offices. She arrived at his desk with a measuring tape, a plant, and a laugh that lived mostly in her eyes. She learned to sign slowly and badly and stubbornly. She made space for him in rooms that forgot to. When someone said we need someone to take notes, she said John is presenting today. When someone called him the subtitles guy, she asked, and what are you without him? Just pictures. He liked her most because she never treated his silence as a problem to solve. She treated it as a place to meet him. Now, in the present, those years pressed against him like armor. Every smirk, every dismissal, every quiet cruelty had carved him into the man he was, precise, relentless, unyielding. And yet, the armor felt heavy today. For the first time, he sensed that exposing the truth could cost him more than professional standing. It might cost him his safety. The office looked unchanged at first. Engineers hunched over laptops, product managers pacing with phones, interns carrying coffee trays like offerings. But John noticed details. Conversations paused when he walked past. Eyes flicked toward him and away, too quickly. Whispers bloomed like smoke in corners. The air was different. His report had entered circulation. Secrets had weight, and people could feel it. At his desk, his phone buzzed. A message from Linda. Conference room 6B. Now, he walked in to find Linda, Michelle, and David behind blinds sliced with morning sun. John, Linda said clearly, this is David Chun, external counsel retained by the audit committee. David extended a hand. John, your report was thorough. Very thorough. We'll need your help as we dig deeper. John nodded. Of course. But, David added, leaning forward, are you aware that suspicion may already be on you? You were in that meeting. You saw things no one else did. That makes you both valuable and vulnerable. The word vulnerable cut like glass. John's pulse quickened. He remembered the email. Don't be a hero. I'll be fine, he said softly, speaking each word with care. He signed alongside his voice. I'm not afraid. Linda's eyes softened, pride mixed with worry. Just stay alert. Things may move quickly now. The day unfolded with a strange rhythm. Meetings buzzed with surface-level chatter, but underneath, tension curled like a wire. John caught fragments of glances, snippets of words. Michael's forced laughter in the kitchen, Darren's hurried walk with his phone clutched tightly, Priya's eyes narrowing at spreadsheets. Everyone was playing a role. Everyone had something to lose. At lunch, Mia appeared at his cubicle with her usual playfulness, balancing 2 coffees and a sticky note folded into a paper boat. Hungry, she signed, her hands clumsy but sincere. Always, he replied with a small smile. They ate outside on the patio. Mia told a story about a disastrous user interview, gesturing animatedly. John listened, grateful for her presence, but his mind kept drifting. He wanted to tell her everything, that he had uncovered something dangerous, that people might be watching him now. But he held back. Protecting her meant keeping her outside the storm. Still, when she signed "You've got this," her fingers forming the phrase with awkward precision, John felt a warmth spread through him. For a moment, the weight lifted. By late afternoon, a new email appeared on his screen. Audit review, confidential. 4 p.m. Mandatory attendance. His heart sank. The net was tightening. The meeting was smaller this time. Linda, Michelle, David, and 2 members of the audit committee dialing in. John presented his findings again, this time with more detail. The canceled invoices, the shell company connections, the procurement bypasses. He explained how lip reading had given him the first clue, careful to clarify the limits of the skill. It isn't magic, he said slowly, each word deliberate. It's context, pattern recognition. You see enough, you know enough. The committee members nodded. This is serious, one said. We'll authorize deeper investigation. That night, as he walked home, the city felt different. Streetlights buzzed faintly, cars streamed by, but he sensed eyes on him. He turned once, twice, saw only strangers, commuters, a cyclist rushing past. Still, the feeling lingered. When he reached his apartment, he double-checked the locks, something he rarely did. On his balcony, he sipped tea and stared at the stars barely visible above the skyline. He thought about his childhood notebooks filled with truths no one wanted to hear. He thought about how those years had prepared him, unknowingly, for this very moment. The conspiracy was real, and so was his duty. He picked up his green notebook and wrote one line before bed. Silence is not absence. Silence is witness. The next morning, on the way to work, a bus braked too quickly and a man cursed under his breath. John didn't hear it, but he saw the shape of the word on the glass as the man's reflection mouthed it. He smiled at the small, useless detail and filed it away with the others that told him the world was still turning as it always had, petty, human, indifferent to anyone's personal earthquake. In the lobby, he met Priya at the elevator. She nodded once, a precise dip of the chin. Her lips formed two words he could read, even with his eyes half on the floor indicator. Be careful. He looked at her, searching for more. She looked away. The doors opened. They stepped in. By noon, Linda pinged him. Interviews tomorrow. Michael, Darren, Priya. You'll sit in. John stiffened. They'll see me there. They already suspect, Linda said when he stopped by her office. But this is the process. We do it clean, or it collapses. He nodded, though dread pressed heavy in his chest. He spent the afternoon preparing. He built a question map, noting what each answer might unlock and where contradictions likely lived. He highlighted the point where emergency procurement exception had been invoked and attached the policy page to the interview packet. He printed a one-pager explaining the difference between a variance and a misallocation so no one could pretend confusion later. He was not the loudest person in the room, but he would be the most prepared. Before leaving, he found a post-it on his monitor. 3 words, last chance, John. No signature, no flourish. He took a breath, peeled it off, pressed it inside the green notebook. He wrote beneath it, I am not the last chance. I am the first witness. That night, he dreamed of waves made of numbers. The first message reached him at 7:12 a.m., a stark block of text on an otherwise unremarkable morning. Audit Committee authorizes investigation. Legal requests full cooperation. Linda. No exclamation marks. No softeners. Just a sentence that changed the temperature of the building. By 9 o'clock, conference room 11C was a bright white box. Fluorescence blew any softness out of the corners, and the blinds were drawn so tight the city outside felt theoretical. On the screen, internal audit, special review, Project Alpha. John sat with his green notebook open and a pen he trusted, the one that never blotted at the worst moment. Across from him, Linda, composed, Michelle from legal, poised, David Chun, external counsel, immaculate in a gray suit that looked airbrushed onto him. Let's start from the beginning, David said, lips carving clean syllables. All of it. John gave them everything he could carry from memory. The choreography of Michael's mouth on round trip, the precise way Darren clipped the word float, the woman's gold chain, and the violin note of Shearwater. He moved to the evidence. Canceled Shorewing invoices, the emergency procurement exceptions, the shared Nevada address with a reputation for housing companies that sold more stories than services. He sketched lines of connection instead of making claims, laying a lattice of facts anyone could climb. Michelle's pen hovered. You're aware, they may already guess you were the observer in the room. John nodded and tapped the inside of his wrist, warning. He said the words, evenly spaced. I received an email. Anonymous. It said, don't be a hero. David didn't blink. Good, he said, and John almost laughed at the word. It means the pressure is real. Good wasn't the word John would have used, but real was. Forensic auditors arrived by noon. They moved lightly, smiling as if to keep the blood pressure down in every room they entered. Their hands ghosted across keyboards, signed in and out of systems, mirror drives, captured logs. Everywhere John walked, he felt the building's respiration change. The usual startup swagger, loud shirts, white sneakers, confident talk about velocity, tilted toward something clipped. Conversations ended as he approached. Even the jokes had a brittle edge. He watched mouths as he carried his notebook through corridors. Freeze in the kitchen. Hole near procurement. This is just a variance, said with a half smile and the tightening around the eyes that was not a smile. Compliance theater. One engineer said, too fast to be certain. He wrote none of that down. Gossip didn't belong in the book. But he wrote the way Darren cradled his phone like a hot stone after meetings, the way Michael lingered near groups, charm dialed up until it hummed, the way the woman with the gold chain. He learned her name was Kira. Watched the auditors move like an art critic judging brushstrokes. At lunch, Mia found him before he could pretend to eat alone. She slid a tray toward him, a bowl piled high with rice and roasted vegetables glistening in the cafeteria's perfect light. She signed slowly, eyes on his. "You look hunted." He signed back, "I'm fine, because sometimes the truth is not utilitarian." She frowned. "No, you're surviving." Then, softer, "I'm here." He held her gaze a beat longer than he should have, feeling the warmth of a human fact the building couldn't regulate. Loyalty. At 3, Linda stopped at his desk and lifted her chin toward the hallway. In 11C again, she signed tomorrow, interviews, and said, "Michael first, then Darren, then Priya." Priya, the head of data science, had said almost nothing in the fatal meeting. That had made John notice her, and noticing became habit. Her posture was careful, an academic's balance between distance and precision. He had seen her glance at Michael in ways that could have been skepticism or respect. He couldn't tell. He made a note to watch her face, not her words. "John," David said, "you'll sit in. Observe. Don't engage unless we ask." He nodded. It would be like every meeting of his life. Attentive silence mistaken for absence. Only this time, the silence would carry a knife. When he returned to his desk, a Post-it sat on his monitor. "Last chance, John." No flourish, no hand that could be matched later, just letters that could belong to anyone. He peeled it off with steady fingers and placed it in his notebook, then wrote beneath it, "Not last." First witness. At 6:05 p.m., on the way to the station, the black SUV rolled into sight and idled a car length behind him before gliding past, glass tinted enough to reflect the street into opacity. John turned into a bookstore he didn't need to be in, waited with a book he didn't read, leaned into the vibration of his own pulse. When he stepped back out, the SUV was gone. He walked to the station feeling like a man with a new shadow. At home, the elevator stalled half a second between floors. One of those movements you feel more than hear, and a flicker of animal panic flashed through him in the pause. When the doors opened, he exhaled. He locked his apartment without counting the clicks. He drew the shades like a ritual. On the balcony, the city was a thin neon X-ray, and the cypress in the courtyard was black ink against a graying sky. He opened the green notebook and wrote, "Slowly, they want me quiet." He underlined it twice. Then he added, "They chose the wrong instrument." Morning broke like it had been warned not to make a fuss. A flat, indecisive gray that turned the towers into cardboard props. John arrived before the lights were fully awake. On his desk, a sheet of printer paper folded once. Inside, a photo of his apartment door, the brass numbers angled just so, the timestamp stenciled at the bottom, 2:13 a.m. He studied the pixels until they stopped being a door and became geometry. Then he slid the photo into the notebook and walked to Linda's office. She looked at the image, her jaw tightening 1 degree. "We'll log it," she said. "We'll escalate security." He nodded. Escalate. Another word that left the mouth confident and entered the world compromised. Michael arrived for his interview at 9 a.m. On the dot, wearing a jacket he didn't need and a smile that said he was on your side, even if you weren't on his. He shook hands, sat, spread his palms on the table like a man offering bread. David's questions were precise. Procurement exceptions, invoice cancellations, scope changes between alpha and beta. Michael's mouth shaped unfortunate timing. "I signed off because the team flagged it urgent. We were going to true it up post-board." Every phrase was draped in context, the kind that makes a sentence safer without making it truer. John kept his eyes on the mouth and hands. He noted when Michael looked to the side before answering. He noted the half-second delay when a date was mentioned. When David raised Shearwater, Michael's lips pressed together in a careful knot smile that said, "New to me." John wrote "not new" in his notebook, just to feel the resistance leave his hand. He did not say it out loud. Darren's interview was a different weather system. The young finance liaison entered in a shirt a shade too bright for the day, sweat already at his temples. His mouth rushed, variants float cross-charge, until it tripped over shore wing and stuttered once, just once, a pebble in stream. He insisted on standard practice, as if the phrase could absorb all moral debt. When asked about the procurement exceptions, he pushed them toward operations. When asked about scope shifts, he orbited them around marketing. Gravity went missing whenever responsibility entered the room. Priya arrived last. Her presence clear in the room the way a tuning fork is clear in an orchestra. She answered slowly. Where Michael and Darren circled jargon, she pared away. She didn't volunteer more than asked, but when she did speak, the answer had weight. John watched her eyes as much as her mouth. When Shearwater came up, she held still, then said, lips precise, I don't sign vendor approvals. I did ask why a cloud consulting firm needed our proprietary access for a modeling audit. I didn't get a clear answer. From whom? David asked. Operations, she said. Darren routed the request. Did you raise it? Michelle asked. With my manager, Priya said. We were told not to block. John wrote not to block in small capital letters and drew a box around it. The phrase would matter. He didn't know how yet. After the interviews, everyone took a breath that passed for lunch. The auditors kept extracting systems like pearls from oysters. Linda sent 3 emails with subject lines that could be read in any mood. David said, we'll need subpoenas without theatrics. Michelle started a list called hold notices, extended that grew like mold in a damp corner. John stepped into the atrium to stretch and found Priya near the glass, a silhouette cut from a clean sheet. She turned as if she'd felt a change in air pressure. Her lips formed 2 words, be careful. He nodded. You too, he signed, then added, after a beat, why warn me? She hesitated, then shaped, you see things, almost a whisper of movement. Then they don't like that. And before he could ask who they were in this building of many thays, she was gone, posture holding its secrets. The SUV returned that evening. John kept walking, took a left he didn't need to take, paused in a pet store to watch a fish stare at him like a coin. He left by a side door and doubled back. The SUV had repositioned. Either he had been clever or the driver had. He waited under the awning of an apartment building that was not his and pretended for a moment to be the kind of person who could walk through any door. When he finally did walk through his own, he did not count the locks by sound or feel. He counted by breath. On the balcony, the cypress shifted almost imperceptibly in a wind that didn't make it to the ground. He tried to imagine the person who left the photo and failed. So he imagined a hand holding a phone in darkness, and that felt both more terrifying and more ordinary. He wrote, escalation is a ladder. Each rung gets thinner. Sleep found him in scraps, the kind of frayed edges you can't stitch to anything. He woke before the alarms shake and lay still, letting the square of morning light on the wall open like a silent mouth. By Thursday, meetings had multiplied. People began naming the problem in euphemisms so thick they scabbed. There were suddenly more stand-ups, more sinks, more touch bases than there were hours. John attended one with senior product managers who avoided the word alpha the way a person avoids a name and a curse. He watched a PM say timeline friction instead of we're stuck and resource flux instead of we lost people, and made a small private dictionary of cowardice to laugh at later when it was safe to laugh. He didn't go to lunch. He made a loop of the building because his body demanded movement. On the 4th floor, he found Kira, the woman with the gold chain, standing with Darren in a corner as if keeping a secret from the walls. Their mouths moved quick. Kira's made the shape of board and optics. Darren's made problem and contain. When they noticed him near the glass, both went still in an almost rehearsed way. Darren offered a tight smile. Kira didn't. John lifted a hand in a gesture so small it could be mistaken for mid-thought and kept walking. At his desk, an envelope waited. No name, no flap glue. Inside, a single screenshot, an internal chat thread with his name highlighted and a sentence. He thinks lip reading is evidence. Beneath it, an emoji that tried to pass for humor. He stared at the pixels until the gray of the interface bled into the gray of the day. He slid the screenshot into the green notebook with the others. He wrote beneath it, they still believe silence equals confusion. Keep letting them. David looped him into a late meeting with legal compliance and a single audit committee member dialing in. The face in the little square was 50-something, tidy, the kind of tidy that implies a lawn that never embarrasses anyone. John presented a short deck he had made to save everyone from drowning in their own intentions. 2 slides on how float works. 1 on round-tripping with a simple diagram. 1 on why canceled invoices matter. And 1 at Linda's request, titled What Lip Reading Is and Isn't. He kept it clean, not a transcript, a set of high-probability inferences augmented by context. Not a verdict, a clue, reliable in aggregate when paired with documentation. The square face nodded. David said, "This is clear." Michelle said, "Thank you." John left the screen feeling like he'd thrown a rope across a gap, and people had decided to grab it. At 9:10 p.m., the building was mostly dark. He packed his bag and paused at the window. In the reflection, his face was 2 shades more tired than yesterday's. He touched the glass with his fingertips and felt the building hum, the way you feel a cat's purr through skin. On the atrium floor below, the cleaning staff moved a vacuum along concrete in slow, even lines that made the building look like something that could be made right again if only you committed a pattern. He turned and found Linda in the doorway, jacket over her arm. She signed thank you, then said, "We'll file hold notices on Michael and Darren in the morning. This will get louder." He nodded. The word louder had a different meaning in his life, but he understood it here. On the ride down, the elevator jittered a fraction the way it always did between 6 and 5. He felt it in his knees. He and Linda stood side by side, hands still, eyes on the numbers. "You okay?" she asked, and moved her mouth clearly. "I will be," he said. Outside, the SUV wasn't visible, which meant nothing. The air smelled like wet concrete and jasmine from a hedge that refused to die. He walked home taking streets he didn't usually take, and at a corner you wouldn't notice if you didn't live here, a man leaned against a lamppost, reading a newspaper like a caricature. John almost laughed. The newspaper was uncreased. He kept walking. Friday arrived with a hard sun and a sky that looked polished. John reached his desk early, powered up, and saw a new email from David. Drafting subpoenas. Expect pushback. Don't engage anyone outside the team. He replied with understood, because anything more could be read out loud later in a tone he wouldn't like. At 10:37 a.m., a Slack message pinged his laptop. "Vic, the junior engineer from across the aisle. Dude, you okay? Rumor mill is a nightmare." John hesitated, then typed, "I'm fine. Work your tickets." Vic sent a salute emoji. Small kindnesses made the walls easier to push against. Just after lunch, the fire alarm screamed. He didn't hear it, but the movement told the story. Chairs scraping, heads lifting, hands grabbing phones before lives. People spilled into the stairwell with a nervous cheer that says we do this all the time, even when they don't. Outside, the sun made everyone squint like the truth. No smoke, no fire trucks yet. John stood on the curb and scanned the sea of mouths. He caught drill and test and someone's cooking. Then from across the street, he saw Kira on her phone, back turned, lips moving fast. He couldn't read from this angle. 2 minutes later, the alarm shut off. Someone said, "False alarm," like the building had a sense of humor. They walked back in, and John couldn't shake the feeling that the evacuation had been a rehearsal for something it wasn't meant to teach. Linda pinged him at 3:04 p.m. Hold notices filed. Legal wants to secure Michael's laptop at 4:30. HR looped. John typed got it and stared at the timestamp for a long breath. 4:30 put tension on the day like a hand twisting cloth. At 4:28, the office felt like the shoreline seconds before a storm admits itself. John watched 4 figures walk toward Michael's glass office. Linda, Michelle, an IT manager with a canvas bag, and a woman he didn't know wearing HR neutrals. Michael rose from his chair with that practiced combination of surprise and grace. John couldn't hear the conversation, but he didn't need to. He watched the mouths. Standard procedure. Temporary. We appreciate cooperation. Michael's smile thinned to a wire. The IT manager unplugged the laptop, slipped it into the bag. HR handed over a document. Michael signed something very slowly, as if each letter owed him money. When they emerged, Michael's mouth made this as absurd to no one in particular. He looked down the aisle, found John's eyes, and held them long enough to make it into an act. Then he looked away. At 5:12 p.m. As the building softened and Friday lowered its shoulders, John packed to leave. His phone buzzed. From unknown. Subject, enough. Body, stop. He flagged it, forwarded it to Linda, and wrote nothing else because fear loves the space between sentences. He took the long way home. The SUV found him anyway, idling at the same too casual distance. He crossed the street. It didn't. He waited at the corner for the light, even though there were no cars. He thought about the photo of his door, the post-it, the screenshot of a chat thread where a joke grew legs and ran. He thought about the one tool he trusted, attention. On the balcony that night, he didn't make tea. He sat with water and the hum of the building that lived under his building. He opened the notebook and began a second report. Longer than the first, sharper, behavioral anomalies and retaliation indicators. He wrote in bullet points that were almost sentences. SUV observed 3 nights. Note on monitor. Photo of apartment door. Internal chat screenshot. False alarm evacuation. Timing suspicious. He attached timestamps where he had them and left margins where he didn't. He emailed a sanitized version to Linda and David with the subject, supplemental, off-ledger indicators. Then he printed a hard copy for the folder. He stared at the green of the cover for a full minute before sliding it into his bag. The color felt stubborn in his hands. Near midnight, a text arrived from a number he recognized only after he'd already tensed. Mia, awake? He replied, yes. 3 dots. Then, just checking you're okay. Saw fire alarm thread. He typed, erased, typed again. I'm okay. Mia, you don't have to be brave in texts. He almost smiled. Not brave. Just busy. 3 dots, longer this time. Mia, then I will be brave for both of us. Lunch tomorrow? My treat. He stared at the screen until the letters blurred, then typed yes, and put the phone face down like a small final act. Sleep came without asking permission and left without saying goodbye. When a shaking alarm alerted him to a morning he hadn't fully met yet, he sat up and pressed his hands into his eyes until sparks bloomed in the darkness. He breathed. He dressed. He left. Saturday wasn't quite a work day, but in Silicon Valley, days pretend they don't understand borders. John took the train to a cafe that smelled like cinnamon and ambition and opened his notebook. He sketched a map, not of networks or cost centers, but of people. In the center, he put Michael, ops, to one side, Darren, finance. Opposite Kira, unknown, slightly above Priya, data, to the edges a scatter of names with lines that terminated in question marks. He drew arrows where pressure flowed. Board date ops optics vendor exceptions. He drew a dotted line from Kira to Shearwater with a note. Unconfirmed link, watch language. He wrote Mia in the corner and underlined it twice with a softer pen. Mia arrived with a swoop of cold air and 2 cups. She placed one in front of him, signed drink, then rested her elbows on the table like the day had asked her to be serious, and she had agreed. I Googled retaliation corporate last night, she said, over-enunciating so he could read easily. Terrible bedtime story. He would have apologized to anyone else. He didn't to her. Thank you, he said, for checking. She reached across, tapped the notebook. You're building a city on paper. He nodded. Cities leave records. People too, she said. More slippery, though. He told her, carefully and without names, that the SUV was not just in his head, that a photo of his door existed, that someone had typed stop into a blank email and sent it as if it were a spell. She didn't flinch. You should stay with me tonight, she said. Spare room. I have a fat orange cat that judges everyone equally. He laughed, silently, mouth full and eyes softer. I'll be okay, he said, because he thought he might be. But thank you. They made a plan to meet again Sunday. Not because of investigation schedules or hold notices, but because it mattered to say we will be in the same room again when rooms could vanish. When she left, she knocked her knuckles against his in a gesture that she had learned to make look like punctuation. He took out the notebook and added to the map, Mia, anchor. On the train back, the city slid past in the window like captions out of sync with their scene. He watched a father toss a ball to a child in a park that looked like a green decision someone had made and then regretted during a drought. He watched a couple argue efficiently, hands slicing the air. He watched a homeless man wash his face in a drinking fountain with a dignity that made John look away. He wrote nothing down. Not everything belongs to the file. At home, he found a new envelope at his door, taped carelessly, like the person who left it was interrupted. Inside, a receipt for an Uber paid in cash from Omega House Cafe, where he and Mia had just been, to an address he didn't recognize. The timestamp was 10 minutes before he left the cafe. The driver's name was blocked with black marker that still smelled faintly chemical. John stood in the kitchen holding the paper and thought about attention as both weapon and wound. He took a photo of the receipt, sent it to David and Linda with the note. Further escalation. Unknown intention. Then he boiled water and made tea the way he did when his hands needed to do something measured. The cypress tree kept being a cypress tree. He kept being a man with a notebook. By Sunday night, the auditors had a list of contradictions. David had a draft set of subpoenas. Michelle had a timetable. Linda had a weary kind of energy that made people want to behave. John had a map that now included a new dotted line from Kira to board optics, based on the way her lips had framed a sentence by the espresso machine. He also had a growing list titled If. If they ask how I know, say logs. If they ask why I looked, say numbers walked. If they ask why I didn't tell Michael, say chain of reporting. If they ask who else knows, say compliance. He closed the notebook and lay it next to the green folder on his table like two stones stacked. He turned off the apartment's lights in a sequence that felt protective without being superstitious. He slept, and this time the sleep had rooms, and the rooms had doors he could open. On Monday, the week opened like a box no one wanted to claim. John walked into the office ready for the next rung on the ladder to get thinner. Instead, he found something stranger, stillness. The SUV was gone. The note stopped. In the kitchen, the fruit bowl held unbruised apples. People said morning with a crispness that felt choreographed. Michael did not show up. Darren did, and his mouth made normal twice in sentences that were not. At 10:02, Linda called him into 11C. David and Michelle were already there, faces arranged for news. What? John asked with his hands and his mouth. David gestured to the chair. Michael resigned over the weekend, he said, effective immediately. The word landed and didn't. Resigned was a word that let people leave before the room told them to. Michelle added, he cited family reasons. We've secured his accounts. Legal will proceed. The board was informed at 9 o'clock. John sat very still. The shape of the story had changed without his permission. Resignation could be a beginning or an end. It was often both. He thought of the SUV, the photo, the receipt. It didn't feel over. There's more, Linda said. We found vendor correspondence from a private email. Kira Vula was copied on 2 threads with Shearwater's agent. We will interview her at noon. John nodded slowly. Pressure reconfigured itself in his chest. And Darren, he asked. 4, Michelle said. We'll speak to him at 4. David leaned forward. John, you don't have to sit in if you don't want to. He did. He had spent his life in rooms where things were decided about him without him. He had accepted the fauna of silence. But he had also learned that attention was sometimes the only weight he could add to a scale. I'll be there, he said. He left 11C and stood in the corridor where the office's glass made mirrors of everyone if they let it. He watched his reflection a moment, not to test if he was real, but to decide if he was ready. He lifted his chin a fraction. The man in the glass did the same. Then he turned toward noon. The week began with Michael's resignation like a stone dropped in still water. The ripples spread in waves too slow to be seen, yet strong enough to tilt the entire building. Whispers clung to every corner. Family reasons, burnout, better offer. But John saw the truth in the pauses between sentences, the dart of eyes, the 4 smiles. They knew, or at least suspected, that Michael hadn't left by choice. For John, it didn't feel like relief. It felt like an opening in the battlefield, the kind of silence soldiers know right before the next barrage. At noon, the interview with Kira began. She entered conference room 11C with a polished calm that belonged more to a boardroom in Manhattan than a tech company in San Jose. Her gold chain was gone, replaced by a simple silver pendant, but her posture said armor more than jewelry. David's voice was neutral as he welcomed her. Linda stayed quiet, a steady presence. Michelle set her pen in the exact center of her notepad, like a blade aligned for cutting. John sat at the end, notebook open, pen waiting. He wasn't introduced this time. No explanation offered for his presence. He was simply there, and Kira's eyes flickered toward him once, quickly, before returning to David. Ms. Vula, David began, lips crisp. We've discovered email correspondence between you and a registered agent for Shearwater LLC. Can you explain the context? Her mouth formed a small smile. Shearwater is a consulting partner we evaluated, she said smoothly. Operations asked me to explore alternatives for cloud auditing. I copied the agent on 2 threads. John's pen moved. Copied agent twice. Michelle leaned forward. Those emails were from your personal account. Kira's lips curved tighter. I was traveling. VPN issues. It was easier. John watched the line of her jaw as she spoke. He had learned long ago to track not just words, but muscles, the micro-hesitations of someone shaping a story too quickly. He wrote, VPN excuse rehearsed. David nodded slowly. Were you aware Shorewing Analytics and Shearwater LLC share an address in Nevada? Her smile didn't falter, but her eyes blinked once, longer than necessary. No, that sounds like coincidence. Nevada has plenty of registered offices. John's pen pressed harder. Blink stall. Linda finally spoke, her mouth deliberate. Did Michael Hart direct you to use Shearwater? Kira's gaze shifted, once to John, then back to Linda. No, he suggested vendors, but I made independent evaluations. My role is due diligence. The words independent and due diligence looked like stone she had polished in her mouth until they shone. John wrote, shield words. The interview lasted 40 minutes. Kira answered each question with measured precision, never rushing, never panicking. But John noticed her left hand, tapping her thumb against her index finger under the table, again and again. Nervous rhythm disguised as composure. He added it to the page. When she left, the room exhaled. She's deeper in this than she admits, Michelle said flatly. David steepled his fingers. We'll need subpoenas for her personal accounts. Phone records if possible. Linda's eyes found John. She didn't speak, but her look said, what did you see? He tapped the notebook. Shield words. Nervous tell. Blink on Nevada. David leaned in. Good. He paused. Dangerous, but good. At 4, Darren arrived for his interview. He looked smaller than usual, as if his shirt had grown overnight. Sweat marked his collar before he even sat. David began with neutral ground, budget cycles, quarterly forecasts, routine variances. Darren rattled answers like a student who studied the wrong chapter. His mouth moved too quickly, words tumbling, skipping. John caught oversight, standard practice, normalization repeated like charms against disaster. Then David shifted. Explain the emergency procurement exceptions used in Q2. Darren froze for half a breath. Operations flagged urgency, he said. I approved under policy. That's standard. Michelle leaned forward. Operations or Michael? Michael, Darren admitted. The word landed like a bead of sweat dropping from his jaw. And Shearwater? David pressed. Darren swallowed. His lips formed a phrase too fast, but John caught it. Michael said fine. David frowned. Excuse me? Darren repeated, slower. Michael said it was fine. I trusted him. John underlined a phrase 3 times in his notebook. By the end, Darren's face shone with perspiration. When he left, he didn't look at John, didn't look at anyone. Crack in the wall, David murmured. We push harder. That night, John walked home with the notebook heavy in his bag. The SUV wasn't there, but absence sometimes felt louder than presence. He entered his apartment cautiously, checked every lock twice, drew the blinds. For dinner, he ate in silence, tracing the day's words across the table in his mind. Independent, due diligence, Michael said fine. At 11 p.m., his phone vibrated with a message from Mia. Cat misses you. Come visit. He smiled despite the weight pressing on him. He typed, tomorrow? She replied with a thumbs-up emoji that somehow looked braver than most sentences. He closed the notebook, slid it under his pillow, and lay awake until the night softened into morning. The next day was a Friday, but it carried none of Friday's usual looseness. HR walked through the halls with careful smiles. IT rolled carts of equipment. The air vibrated with rumors. Michael's gone, Darren's next, Kira's in trouble. At noon, John sat in the cafeteria, eating slowly, when Priya slid into the seat across from him. She placed a paper cup in front of him. Tea, not coffee. Careful, her lips said. He tilted his head. Why? He signed. She glanced around. Kira's furious, she mouthed the word small. She thinks you're the leak. John froze. He had always known suspicion would turn, but hearing it, seeing it, made his stomach clench. Why me? Because you don't talk, Priya said. And people fear silence more than words. He wrote in his notebook, they suspect me. Then he looked at Priya. And you? She held his gaze. I saw what you saw, she said, lips sharp. Not all of it, but enough. I won't betray that. It wasn't a promise. It was an alignment, temporary but real. That evening, John joined Linda and David in a call with the audit committee. The committee chair, a stern woman with silver hair, asked blunt questions. John answered when asked, precise and steady, explaining lip reading as evidence but not gospel, invoices as patterns, not opinions. He could feel the weight of her eyes on him, even through the screen. When the call ended, Linda signed good work. David added, they'll move to formal action next week. Possibly law enforcement. John nodded, but inside he felt the ground shift again. Formal action meant escalation. Escalation meant retaliation. On Saturday morning, he took Mia's offer. Her apartment was warmer, cluttered in a way that felt human. The orange cat leapt onto his lap and stared at him with the kind of judgment that was almost comfort. Mia brewed coffee, then sat across from him, signing badly but bravely. Tell me truth. And for the first time he did. Not every detail, no names, no companies, but enough that she understood the danger. When he finished, she reached across the table and took his hand. Then you're not alone, she said. The words landed in him like a breath he hadn't realized he'd been holding for years. Sunday brought another envelope under his door. This time, not a note or photo, but a flash drive. No label, just plastic and metal, waiting like a dare. He didn't plug it in. Instead, he placed it in a plastic bag, sealed it, wrote the time and date in his notebook. Monday, he handed it to Linda. She looked at it, jaw tight. They're getting sloppy, she mouthed. Or desperate. Both, John said. The following week promised subpoenas, police involvement, and board-level fallout. But as John walked out of the building that Monday evening, notebook pressed against his chest under the jacket, he knew the real war wasn't in court filings or compliance memos. It was here, in whispers, in threats, in the photo of his door at 2:13 a.m. And as long as he kept seeing, he would keep surviving. Because silence wasn't weakness. It was witness sharpened into weapon. And John had no intention of putting it down. At 11:47 p.m., the badge reader outside operations blinked green. John didn't hear the chime, but he felt the room shift. The building's security console lived in a windowless space 2 floors down from the lobby. A small, humming bunker of status lights and soft chairs where the night guard drank coffee and watched the city on 26 screens. Tonight the chairs were occupied by unusual guests. Linda, hair clipped back and sleeves rolled. Michelle from legal. David in the same precise gray. An IT incident lead named Sonal. And John, hands folded over his green notebook, attention tuned like a wire. On the largest monitor, a line of text scrolled. User, Kavula. Access, Ops Suite, 23 hours, 47 minutes, and 13 seconds. Got you, Sonal murmured and pointed. Michelle's pen hovered. We filed our hold notice at 5 p.m. Any file activity after that is sanctionable. Sanctionable, David said. is a word we use before another word, actionable. Linda's eyes, steady even at midnight, flicked to John. Her mouth shape, watch. He nodded. It was the one thing he trusted himself to do at any hour. Another line appeared. Device, iPhone, connected to guest Wi-Fi. A second later, VPN, external, obfuscated. Sonal's fingers flew. She's on guest, but she just tried to bounce through a personal VPN. Guest filters blocked it. She's falling back to LTE. An image from the elevator camera flickered. Kira, alone, eyes forward, face untroubled. She'd changed from a silver pendant to nothing at all. Her throat clean and unadorned. The uniform of someone with nothing to hide. She won't find what she wants, Linda said. IT quarantined her shared folders. David's mouth tightened. People in a corner don't want what they want. They want what they can destroy. At 11:52, another badge pinged. User, Dr. Lee, access, Ops Suite, 23 hours, 52 minutes, and 1 second. Darren, Linda breathed. Michelle made a neat dot on her legal pad, the icepick of punctuation. Sonal toggled to a camera angle above the operations hallway. Two figures coming in opposite directions, then converging. John leaned closer to the screen, the reflex of a lifetime, eyes searching for syllables in the pale choreographies of their mouths beyond glass. Kira's lips shaped phone. Darren's shaped backup. Kira's shaped tonight. Darren swallowed. His mouth formed not safe. Kira's made now or never. The words came to John like a faint but clear signal through interference. What were they doing? Michelle asked. John tapped the notebook and wrote in block letters, phone. Backup. Tonight. He underlined now or never and slid the page toward them. Linda read, nodded once. David stood. We're not a police department, but we can be a wall. He turned to Sonal. Lock their access beyond read-only. Capture everything. Mirror the devices. Quietly, Sonal's mouth pulled into a slim smile that said, I've been waiting all my life to be allowed to do exactly that. On it, they watched for 12 minutes that stretched thin as wire. Cameras provided angles. Logs provided time. John provided the bridge between what the room could see and what it could know. Kira led Darren to a side room, a glass cube with a table and a single credenza. There, she lifted her phone and pointed the lens at a document folder from the credenza, snapping photo after photo. Physical files? Michelle said, incredulous. In 2025? Sloppy, David said. Also, useful. Sonal zoomed in. The camera didn't give letters, but it gave shapes. The top corner of a cover page with the faint silhouette of a logo that looked like a bird's wing. Shore wing. John felt the tiny clutch of recognition in his chest, the way a key catches in a lock and promises either opening or breaking. Kira spoke again, mouth rapid. Hotel, tonight. Escrow, release. Darren's face paled. Police? He asked. Soon, Kira's mouth replied. And then, we finish first. We need to know where, Linda said, already pulling her bag up onto her shoulder. Baylight, John said, watching Kira's mouth shape the word again. He wrote it big, underlined it. Baylight. David's head turned, eyes alert. We are not law enforcement, but the committee liaison is on call. He reached for his phone. If they're moving evidence off-site, we have one chance to catch the hand and the cookie jar in the same photo. He dialed. I'll bring our liaison up to speed. Baylight Hotel. Escrow. Tonight. Linda looked at John. Come with us, she said, not as a question, but as an invitation to the risk she already knew he would accept. He nodded, shutting his notebook with a single, decisive press. The Baylight Hotel sat 3 blocks from the bay and pretended to be closer. Its lobby was a geometry of soft beige and expensive quiet, a place designed to make money feel like taste. Linda and John entered first. David followed with the liaison from the city's white-collar unit, a compact woman named Alvarez whose eyes had the patience of dried granite. We're observers until we aren't, she said, lips easy for John to read. If we see a transaction, physical evidence exchange, or explicit conspiracy, we move. Linda hooked a left to the lobby bar, a long rectangle of darkwood with views through to the restaurant beyond. John's eyes went glass to glass. letting reflections become lenses. There, Kira at a corner table, posture symmetrical, a tumbler of something amber within reach but untouched. Opposite her, a man in a suit that tried not to be noticed and failed out of sheer expense. His mouth had the practiced economy of someone used to billing by the minute. Shorewing's agent or Shearwater's? It didn't matter. The birds were the same. Minutes later, Darren slipped in, underslept, and overdressed in the wrong way. He took the third chair, placed his phone carefully face down, and didn't touch the drink the server set gently in front of him. John and Linda settled at the bar with a sight line. Alvarez took a high top, face in the glow of a phone she wasn't really reading. David hovered between. John watched. Kira spoke first. "We do the release," she said to the suited man. "Then we disappear." The man's mouth shaped Mauritius. Darren's flickered with the shape of Y. Kira's followed with "because custody" and 2 hops and no eyes. John's pen moved across the notebook. Release. Disappear. Mauritius. Custody. 2 hops. No eyes. Darren's lip pressed into his teeth until the skin blanched. "Michael's out," he said. "It's over." Kira shook her head. Stories don't end when someone exits stage left. Her mouth formed, smooth and contemptuous. They end when the audience stops paying attention. John felt the sentence land the way a blade lands into wood. Clean, efficient, leaving a shape that cannot be unmade. The suited man slid a folder across the table. Kira opened it, scanned, nodded. Escrow instructions, her mouth. Signature, then release. Darren didn't move. Alvarez, from her high-top throne, didn't move either, but John saw her eyes sharpen. Law had the same predator's stillness that John's attention did. Different prey. Same patience. Darren's hands trembled. He mouthed, "I can't," in a way that read like prayer, not refusal. Kira leaned in, her face an inch from his, her lips forming "you already did," and then "be consistent." She tapped the folder. He took the pen. "Now," David whispered toward Alvarez, though John didn't need to hear it to understand. "We have exchange, coercion, pattern." Alvarez stood just as a man in a hotel blazer approached the table, too tidy to be coincidence. He smiled the way hotel staff are trained to smile when asked to interrupt important people, with velvet apology. Kira's mouth formed not now. The man's mouth formed, of course, but he didn't leave. He moved to a position just behind Darren, where a security camera's arc could catch his profile. Alvarez altered course mid-step and drifted behind the camera's cone. The lobby experienced that particular kind of silence inside expensive places when 2 realities overlap, and both pretend the other one isn't there. Hotel and crime. Hospitality and extraction. Darren's pen hovered over the page. "I can't," he mouthed again, but this time his mouth was a child's mouth. Kira's face didn't change. Her lips formed, "Then you're already finished." He signed. Alvarez took the final 3 steps like a metronome and placed a hand on the table. "Hi," she said, voice low and clear. "I'm Detective Alvarez with the city's Financial Crimes Unit. We'll be taking that folder." Kira's mouth didn't move for a full second, a bloom of shock that was almost beautiful in its honesty. Then she smiled, the kind of airless smile a person wears to a funeral where they are both eulogist and corpse. The suited man's hand twitched toward the folder and then stopped when he saw the badge. Darren went colorless and soft. Kira leaned back. "Do you have a warrant?" she asked. John didn't need to hear the sound to catch the shape. Alvarez lifted a single page in a plastic sleeve. Not a warrant for the hotel, but a grand jury authorization for record seizure connected to an ongoing fraud investigation, paired with the hotel's consent to cooperate. It was a door that opened all the others the hotel could open voluntarily. "We'll be taking copies," Alvarez said, "and I'd appreciate it if none of you left the building for the next few minutes." Kira's smile didn't falter, but her left hand made a tiny motion under the table, thumb against index, the metronome John had learned to look for in her. Her attention flicked, once, to the bar, where John sat just long enough to be seen and then not. A recognition passed between them, not intimate but precise. "You saw me. I see you." Then she turned to Darren. Her lips formed consistent, one last time like a curse. "At 2:10 a.m. They were back in the security bunker. Copies from the Baylight lay on the table. Escrow instructions from a boutique firm with a full-page mission statement and the soul of a shell. Draft contract that turned consulting into a centrifuge. A transfer path that looked like nothing if you didn't know how to read rivers. Company Shearwater Shorewing Port Louis, Mauritius, compliance retainer, Asia. Sonal's fingers made rapid constellations over the keyboard. The photos she took tonight? The phone pushed them to iCloud before she put it on airplane mode. Her backups are syncing to a personal email alias. Mirroring now. Michelle's pen began making list columns with names at the top. Who knew? Who could know? Who chose not to know? Different liabilities wore different clothes. David read silently, then looked up. This is enough to shift from concern to case. Linda nodded. The board will convene a special session within 48 hours. We'll recommend termination for cause for Kira, referral for prosecution for Michael, and a conditional internal discipline for Darren, pending cooperation. John wrote each name with one verb beneath it. Kira, orchestrate. Michael, direct. Darren, enable, and underlined enable twice as if the repetition itself were an indictment. He thought of Darren's mouth on I can't, and he thought of the pen anyway. He stood, stretched his back, and felt the building hum in his bones. Not the usual midnight pulse. Something tighter, nearer. Sonal frowned at a new window on her screen. That's odd. What? Linda asked. Fire suppression panel, Sonal said. Server room pre-charged, just armed. No scheduled tests. And she clicked twice. Someone with elevated credentials is on a secure remote session to the suppression controller. David's head snapped up. Who has those credentials? Very few, Sonal said. Facilities? 2 techs. And ops. Ops. Linda repeated, flat as a floor. John didn't wait for sound or approval. He was already moving a clear stripe through the bunker, down the corridor, up the stairs. Buildings have rhythms. He'd learned this one. The server room lived on 5, tucked behind a door with a red placard that meant nothing until it meant oxygen could vanish. When he reached it, 2 figures stood outside, a facilities tech with a badge he recognized, and a second man with a contractor lanyard he didn't. They were talking too quickly. The contractor's mouth formed override. The tech's formed you sure. The contractor's answered do it. John stepped forward and raised a hand. Hold up, he signed and said, hey. The tech startled. The contractor didn't. Server maintenance, the contractor said, over-enunciating with a political smile, as if volume could do what honesty wouldn't. Scheduled. John shook his head and pointed his wrist where a watch would be. At 2:30 in the morning. He pointed to the placard, then to the keypad. He didn't need to say, show me work order. The gesture was a language. The tech looked at the contractor. The contractor's mouth made no time. His hand moved to the keypad. John stepped between the man and the door, heart loud enough to be motion. The contractor's expression flattened. Move, he said. The lips were lazy on the vowel. The consonants were hard. In the second before anything else could happen, Linda and David came around the corner with Alvarez at their shoulder, badge up like a light. The contractor shifted his weight to leave, but Alvarez was faster. Don't, she said, and though John didn't hear it, he understood. The tech put his hands up, palms open, eyes wide. The contractor didn't. He reached for the keypad again, and David's hand caught his wrist with surprising force. Credentials, Alvarez said, and held out her hand. The contractor hesitated, then produced a card. Sonal appeared at a run, breathless. That card's cloned, she said. ID number belongs to a retired employee. Alvarez's mouth made the smallest smile. Thank you. She turned to the contractor. You're coming with me. The man tried the shrug of a professional who's just been told the parking validation won't cover their ticket. It didn't fit him well. He glanced at John, and John saw it. The flicker of calculation that attempts to turn a human into a variable. Def means delay. Delay means chance. It was a fatal misread. John held the man's eyes, then looked at the pre-charge light on the panel. He tapped it and raised his eyebrows. Active? Sonal nodded. We have 30 seconds if he armed it. Disarm, Linda said. Sonal's fingers became music. The light stayed on. Local override required, she hissed. Door, David said. Alvarez nodded. Nobody breathed fast. They entered the server room in an air that smelled like cold and expensive. Racks hummed. Lights pulsed. The pre-charge alarm flashed in silent red. Sonal went straight to the control box with a key that looked like a short answer to a long question. Manual override, she said. 3-2 now. The red light paused, then went dark. No gas, no purge, no destruction of evidence disguised as safety. Sonal leaned her forehead to the metal for a second, then laughed a shocked, quiet laugh. He almost toasted us, she said. John exhaled a breath he hadn't known he'd been holding since Baylight. He pressed his palm to the nearest rack and felt the building's heartbeat come down 2 notches. Alvarez escorted the contractor away. The facilities tech, who had looked like a man watching a train he did not want to board, slumped and said something that John didn't need to read to understand. I'm sorry. Linda touched John's elbow, a rare gesture. You saved our case, her mouth said. He shook his head. He hadn't saved anything. He'd paid attention. Dawn was a thin gray behind glass when they assembled in 11C with paper cups and faces that looked exactly like what they had been through. Priya stood just inside the door, arms crossed, not part of the team and also indispensable to it. Sonal laid out the outputs. Mirror images, captured logs, stills from hotel cameras, server room events with timestamps. Alvarez summarized the man with a cloned card. A contractor with 3 layers between him and whoever had paid him, now in a holding cell considering his own ratios of loyalty to self-preservation. Michelle read the law against the facts and said the words probable cause with the calm of a surgeon washing her hands. Linda briefed the board liaison on a secure line. David began writing the skeleton of a brief that would travel to a district attorney's desk before lunch. Priya stepped forward and handed over 2 pages. Access request that had crossed her desk asking for temporary model audit credentials for Shearwater. The request had not come through the official channel. The signatures looked like signatures until you looked at them twice. John opened his notebook and added a new page at the back, separate from the others, with a single heading, What We Owe Each Other. Under it, he wrote 3 phrases. Truth, even when it costs. Attention, especially when it's easier not to look. Witness, when noise tries to erase signal. He closed the notebook and looked out across the glass city, its edges catching the first honest light. In it, he saw a boy misread by a teacher, a young man underestimated by peers, and the man he had become, quiet by design, loud only where it counted. Mia texted, Kat approves of you saving the world. He smiled, small and real. He wrote back, Tell him I accept his judgment. Linda clapped once, the gesture a little ragged. Next steps, temporary suspensions, law enforcement coordination, communications to staff. We keep the circle small. We stay boring in public. We move fast where it matters. David looked at John. You should go home. Sleep. Then write exactly what you saw at Baylight. Real-time notes. Details get slippery when you're tired. John nodded. Sleep felt like a rumor, but writing felt like oxygen. He gathered the green notebook, placed his pen exactly parallel to its spine, and stood. In the doorway, Priya caught his sleeve. Her lips formed be careful, and then, after a beat, thank you. He shook his head. She inclined hers anyway, then stepped back into the room, a precise silhouette among precise work. John walked down the hall lined with glass. The building's hum settled into a human register he recognized. Weary, relieved, not done. He rode the elevator alone and felt the jitter between 6 and 5. On the ground floor, Lena at the desk signed, Good morning with confetti hands, and for once the gesture landed without irony. Outside, the sky had traded gray for blue. The cypress in his courtyard would be lit like a page when he reached it. He thought of all the ways the story could still turn. Kira's contingencies, Darren's choices, Michael's shadow that might not be done casting. And he thought of the one constant he could pledge without speech, attention. It had been the instrument of his life. It would be the instrument of his ending when endings came. Until then, there was a sentence to write, a city to observe, a truth to hold steady in a room full of glass and hands and the strange music of people trying to be better than they were yesterday. John put his head down and walked toward home. The boardroom had never been so full. Rows of leather chairs lined the long walnut table. Screens flickered with muted video feeds where committee members joined from New York, London, and Singapore. The air was too cold, the coffee too hot, and the silence before things began was the kind that hummed like a storm pressed against the glass. John sat at the end, green notebook in front of him. He hadn't planned to be here, not at the center of the storm he'd uncovered, but Linda had insisted. The board needs to see you. They need to see how this started. They need to see why we believe. So he sat, watching, waiting. Michael entered first. He wore his old confidence like a suit freshly pressed. A faint tan still glowing, shirt without a wrinkle, smile cut sharp enough to slice out in half. The air seemed to bend toward him as he moved. But John's eyes weren't fooled. The smile wavered in fractions. The jawline held too rigid. He carried himself not like a man in charge, but like a man trying to impersonate his former self. Then came Kira, escorted by 2 compliance officers and Alvarez. Her hair was loose, her face pale, but steady. She held no notebook, no laptop, only a folded tissue in one hand that she didn't use. Her gaze skimmed the room and then landed on John. It stayed there too long, unblinking, until Linda spoke her name. Finally, Darren. Shoulders hunched, skin clammy, suit ill-fitted. He moved like gravity had singled him out. He avoided everyone's eyes, especially John's. Linda called the meeting to order. Today we present findings from the internal review of Project Alpha and related vendor accounts. Her mouth said, each word slow and deliberate for John. We will hear from key individuals, review evidence, and confirm next steps. The chair of the board, a man with silver hair and a voice that sounded like stone on glass, spoke next. These allegations, if substantiated, carry not just financial impact, but reputational risk. Our responsibility is to shareholders, employees, and the law. Ms. Park, proceed. Linda laid out the case. Canceled invoices, duplicate shells, emergency procurement abuses. She displayed charts, timelines, annotated screenshots. Her tone was surgical, not theatrical. Then she paused. But the investigation began not with a spreadsheet, she said. Her eyes found John. It began with an observation. The board chair's gaze followed. Mr. Lin, he said, mispronouncing the name John had corrected a dozen times in his career. Tell us. John opened his notebook. His pen touched the page not to write, but to steady him. He raised his head. I saw their mouths, he said carefully, each syllable exact. His voice, rarely used, filled the room not with power but with clarity. Round trip, Shearwater, float, redirect. After board sign-off, he let the words hang like weights dropped on the table. Lip reading, one director asked, skepticism bending her mouth. Yes, John said. He didn't flinch. Not perfect, not magic, but enough. Enough to look deeper. Enough to find the paper that did not lie. He tapped the folder Linda had placed near him. Linda slid copies down the table. Charts of vendor flows, screenshots of canceled invoices, photographs of escrow instructions at the Baylite Hotel. Alvarez added her own report. The attempted sabotage of the server room. The contractor with the clone badge. The midnight near disaster. The board chair's eyes moved from the papers to Michael. Response? Michael's smile didn't break, but it thinned. Overzealous compliance. Misinterpretation. Shearwater was exploratory. Escrow drafts never executed. Shorewing canceled before any funds moved. This is smoke, not fire. John watched his lips. Smooth. Practiced. But when he said smoke, his tongue pressed hard against his teeth, a subtle tell of strain. John wrote it down. Kira's turn came next. She didn't bother with denial. Operations directed alternatives, she said coolly. I followed. Procurement had exceptions. Finance approved. You can discipline me for process. But fraud? That requires intent. Show me intent. Her mouth was a blade. But John had already read intent in her every blink, every nervous tap, every late-night whisper. Then Darren. He collapsed under the weight before anyone asked a question. It's true, his lips formed, voice trembling. Michael told me. Kira pressured me. I signed. I shouldn't have. I'm sorry. The room cracked. Linda didn't move. Michelle's pen simply underlined admission. Alvarez leaned back, eyes steady. Michael's composure fractured. He's weak, his mouth spat. He'll say anything under pressure. But the board chair held up a hand. Enough. He turned to John. Mr. Lynn, do you believe fraud occurred? John met his gaze. He thought the boy in the classroom, told he must have misheard. He thought of every dismissal, every smirk, every note in the green notebook that no one else cared to read. Yes, he said, voice quiet but immovable. I believe it. Because I saw it. Because I tracked it. Because the numbers and the mouths told the same story. Silence followed. Not disbelief, not dismissal, but wait. The kind of silence that holds respect. The board deliberated in closed session. John waited in the hall with Linda and Mia, who had slipped in quietly and stood beside him like gravity itself. Her hand brushed his once, not grasping, just anchoring. After an hour, the doors opened. The chair returned. His lips shaped the words, termination for cause, referral to law enforcement, cooperation with prosecutors, immediate suspension of implicated accounts. Michael's face went ash-gray. Kira laughed once, short and sharp, as if the absurdity of consequence still surprised her. Darren buried his head in his hands. John only wrote one word in his notebook. Done. The days that followed were strange. The office buzzed with half-truths and rumors. Some people treated John like a hero. Others avoided him, guilty for every smirk, every dismissal. HR sent a polite email about ongoing support for employees affected by recent events. The press circled, hungry, but the company released only sterile statements. Through it all, John kept working. Same desk, same spreadsheets, same quiet diligence. But something had shifted. People no longer asked him to take notes in meetings. They asked him what he thought. Mia teased him one afternoon. You're famous. He shook his head. Not famous. Visible. She grinned. Sometimes visibility is revolution. A week later, he walked into Linda's office. She was packing books into a box, policy binders, framed photos, the silver pin she always wore. You're leaving? He signed, startled. She nodded. Board asked me to step into an expanded oversight role. Global compliance. New York. He felt the tremor in his chest. She had been his anchor. She had believed him when no one else did. You'll do well, she said, reading his silence. And so will you. She pointed to his notebook. That's your power. Don't forget it. On a Friday evening, John sat on his balcony with Mia, and the orange cat sprawled across his lap. The city hummed below, indifferent and alive. You changed things, Mia signed, her hands clumsy, but her eyes steady. He shook his head. I paid attention. Same thing, she replied. He smiled faintly. He thought of silence, not as absence, not as weakness, but as witness. He thought of how it had carried him through classrooms, offices, boardrooms, into a battle fought with whispers and invoices and shadows. And he thought of what came next, because silence wasn't just a shield. It was a tool. And now, finally, people had learned to listen. John opened his notebook and wrote one last line under the heading What We Owe Each Other. To listen to those who see differently. Because sometimes difference is the only reason the truth survives. He closed the book, leaned back, and let the night settle over him like a long, steady breath.